Good day, my name is Gracelin Baskaran. I'm the director of the Critical Mineral Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm joined by Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, Geoff Pyatt. Ambassador Pyatt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having the conversation.
While we're incredibly disappointed we can't make it to IMARC this year, we were very honored to accept the invitation to deliver an address. So with that, I guess here we go. It's an election year, and people often ask me what this means for U.S. mineral security interests. The reality is that critical mineral security is one of the most bipartisan issues in Washington, D.C. Both Presidents Trump and Biden issued executive orders to build mineral security to strengthen national and energy security and economic competitiveness. There has been a global recognition of the importance of net zero ambitions. This has had a direct impact on forecasted demand for key critical minerals. Modeling undertaken by the IEA in 2020 showed that we would go from needing roughly 7 million tons of critical minerals in 2020 to nearly 150 million tons by 2050. Mining companies saw sunshine in the years to come. In fact, at the beginning of 2021, JP Morgan analysts took a bullish view on minerals and metals, suggesting that the world had likely entered its fifth commodity supercycle since the early 1900s. A supercycle, by definition, spans at least 10 years. But today, cobalt, nickel, and lithium prices are nearly at 4-year lows. What we didn't see coming were the exogenous shocks that followed the Paris Agreement. They had a significant impact on global minerals demand and depressed private sector mining activity. A quick look at what's driving this. First, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which neither you nor I expected. We saw an unprecedented amount of fiscal support go to businesses and households, which drove up demand and prices, triggering inflation. In response, central banks worldwide raised interest rates. Here in the US, the Fed raised interest rates 11 times in 2022 and 2023 to rein it in. When interest rates are high, people buy less things like cars, computers, household appliances, and luxury goods. Data shows an inverse relationship between interest rates and commodity prices. The higher the rates, the lower the base metals prices. We saw this particularly on electric vehicles. I'm from Detroit. I love the automotive industry. However, until March 2023, dealerships sold EVs faster than gasoline-powered vehicles. But when the Fed raised interest rates to 5% back in April last year, a significant divergence emerged. Your gasoline-powered vehicle began selling faster than EVs, which were $52,000 on average. By the end of 2023, the EV took nearly 70 days to sell in the US compared to 42 days for a gasoline-powered vehicle. Second was the slowdown of the Chinese economy. 5 years ago, many of us thought the Chinese economy was too big to fail. But growth over the last 2 decades was remarkable. Between 2000 and 2009, GDP growth rates were between 5.6 and 13.6%. It was the biggest off-taker for the world's base metals. But China's economy has slowed down quite considerably, and some of these challenges are structural in nature. High levels of local government debt, a collapsing real estate market, high youth unemployment. In 2022, China's economy grew just 3%. This was the second lowest since 1991, only behind the COVID-19 pandemic year of 2020. And in 2023, most of the world was still raising interest rates, but China was cutting theirs. Data from 2024 showed that China was actually starting to experience a decline in consumer prices, which we call deflation. April 2024, Fitch downgraded China's economy from neutral to negative. China's economy is no longer the world's biggest engine of growth, and instead, muted demand will affect minerals-intensive goods and prices. The IMF recently raised alarm on China's fiscal situation and noted its economic outlook was tilted to the downside. And finally, we've seen market manipulation, and this has been particularly felt in Australia. Despite low demand, Chinese government-backed firms are ramping up production, which is putting downward pressure on commodities prices and forcing Western companies to close. For example, Indonesia's nickel production has rapidly ramped up and is contributing to a global nickel surplus and a resulting decline in prices. Between 2021 and 2022, Indonesia's nickel production increased by 48%, and in the following year by another 29%. This oversupply has impacted prices and the profitability of major mining companies and created uncertainty about the future of nickel markets. This has forced closure of nickel mines in Australia and New Caledonia. So this brings us to a place of where we are today. We know that creating resilient, secure mineral supply chains is of utmost importance to our national security, energy security, and economic competitiveness. But the private sector is hesitant. They have fiduciary responsibility to their environment, to their shareholders, in an environment of price volatility. Private mining sector activity is nearing a 4-year low. Of course, we know copper is the exception. Copper markets are booming. It's a necessary material for advanced technologies that make up the global economy. Infrastructure, clean energy technology, electronics, automotives. Copper wires connect our electrical grids, integrated circuits, and telecommunication systems. It's the second most widely used material in weapons platforms by weight. It's vital for the modern economy. Copper demand is expected to grow not only because of renewable energy, but also growing population, urbanization, artificial intelligence boom. In order to meet net zero emissions, the Biden administration goals, annual copper supply would need to double by 2035. The AI industry is putting more pressure. Data centers that process AI applications could demand up to 200,000 metric tons of copper per year by 2025, adding another 2.6 million metric tons to the copper deficit in 2030. So what do we need to do? A couple quick recommendations before we turn it over to the real expert and Assistant Secretary Pyatt. First, governments need to step in and create incentives for the private sector investment, provide loan guarantees and concessional financing to reduce the cost of capital. This is particularly true for junior mining companies, and the U.S. has made a lot of headway in creating these government partnerships to incentivize that investment in recent years. Second, we need to focus on building responsible mining practices to reduce the friction between government, mining companies, and indigenous communities. We have an obligation to minimize the negative health and environmental externalities for the mining sector. Third, we need to invest in recycling. I once asked a friend in the mining industry, how much do we need to mine? His answer, as little as possible. We need to build our recycling capacity in the circular economy. And finally, we need to work together, and not necessarily in just a historical friendshoring way. We need old friends and new friends. We will not meet the growing demand for minerals alone. We need to work with countries in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, given their deep mineral reserves, much of which are unmapped and undertapped. But we need to create a more mutually beneficial model of mining to ensure countries are benefiting from their resources in an equitable manner. With that, you've heard far too much from me, and I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Pyatt.
Great. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to join Gracelin for this conversation. It's also great to be able to speak remotely with friends at IMARC. I'm sad that I can't be there personally, but I want you to understand how strongly my team in the State Department's Energy Bureau is focused on our alliance with Australia. As somebody who spent a big chunk of my professional career working in and on the Asia-Pacific region, Australia has always loomed very large. But that is more true than ever over the past 2 years that I've been responsible for leading the State Department's energy diplomacy. Australia is, of course, a superpower when it comes to issues of energy, and especially energy minerals. It is one of the world's largest producers of lithium. It's a major source of traditional energy going into global markets, especially in Asia. And in particular, it has been a uniquely strong partner with the United States under the leadership of President Biden and Prime Minister Albanese, as we seek simultaneously to accelerate the energy transition, but also build our energy security. I had an opportunity to appreciate this even more in the spring, or I guess in your fall, when I traveled to Western Australia and Perth. It was incredibly impressive for me to see the overwhelming role that the extractive industries, and especially the mining industry, plays in the Western Australia economy, to meet with leaders of your globally competitive mining companies, but also to see the innovation that's happening with Australian companies who are working to lower the carbon intensity of their production. All the innovation that's being led by companies like Fortescue, BHP, Rio Tinto, looking at how to lower the energy requirements of mineral extraction and processing, innovation in areas like clean hydrogen, the decarbonization of the large amounts of materials that have to be moved to support the extraction of energy minerals. I'll always remember listening to Andrew Forrest talking about his infinity train and the concept of developing an electric-powered locomotive that would deliver iron ore from the mine face to ports with essentially zero net energy requirement, by capturing the latent energy of descending to sea level and then using the storage of that energy to carry the locomotive back up to the mine face. That's exactly the kind of innovation that I know Australian companies are going to be principal partners for the United States with. And of course, we have some of the largest foreign investment in Australia by American companies working in the energy space. But I also have a clear sense, in part because Ambassador Rudd has been very, very vocal on this issue here in Washington, D.C., of how the Australian mineral economy has been rocked by the distortions that are produced in particular by China's overproduction of key minerals like lithium and nickel, by the lack of transparency in pricing, and by the reality that as we look out to the future, as Gracelin talked about, the world is going to need massively increased quantities of cobalt, lithium, nickel, zinc, copper, and rare earths in order to meet our energy transition goals. But we want to do so in a way that doesn't enhance China's ability to manipulate markets and to undermine our national security, or for that matter, the national security of our allies. So I will be very interested to hear some of the takeaways from this year's IMARC at a particularly central moment in the conversation about the nexus between energy minerals and energy security. I will also be keen to see the recommendations that emerge on these issues of pricing. The Biden administration has committed through our Critical Minerals Task Force, led on the Australian side by Minister King, to having a very intense collaborative partnership with our Australian allies on these issues. As in so many aspects of the U.S.-Australian relationship, we enjoy a uniquely strong set of ties, but we're also working together across the Indo-Pacific region, through the Quad, through our work with key allies in Asia, like Japan, like Korea, the investments that happen in both directions. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us. I'm very proud of what we've established with my team and our colleagues at DQ and DFAT through the U.S.-Australia Energy Security Dialogue. But I also recognize that at the end of the day, the proof of our success is going to be what our companies are able to do together. So I wish you the very best for your conversations there in Australia and look forward to teasing out some of these issues with Gracelin over the next couple of minutes.
I'm personally very disappointed I'm not in Australia, so we'll have to put it on our agenda pretty high for next year. So one of the questions I have is, you were in Australia earlier this year, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about your insights. But I think back to when I lived in Australia 10 years ago. And I remember all the way back then, Australia had already committed to becoming a mining center of excellence. You know, mining's contribution to Australia's GDP is about 15%. It's like 1% of ours, maybe on a good year. So it is such a significant ally in that way. What were your key takeaways from your trip to Australia?
So first of all, I love getting to Perth because it reminded me of my hometown of San Diego. There is no city in the world that has the same vibe that San Diego does more than Perth, in my experience. But also because of what you described, which is the centrality of mining and all the extractive industries in the Western Australia economy. Just doing the flight from Melbourne to Perth or Perth to Canberra, as I did, is a good lesson in the geography of Australia and how big Western Australia is, but also how much space there is. The tremendous potential, and it was so interesting to see the innovation that's happening, for instance, in electrification of mining operations in Western Australia, leveraging the region's enormous abundance of wind and solar resources. Hearing from Australian companies about some of the work they are doing to lower the above-ground footprint of their operations. Hearing about some of the innovation that's happening. I had the opportunity also to visit one of the universities in Perth, and you see there, I mean, again, mining is woven into the economy and the life of Western Australia as it is no place else in the world that I can think of. But lots and lots of innovation looking at how to build the volumes of energy minerals that we're going to need to meet our energy transition goals in the most sustainable way possible. It was also, as I talked about earlier, interesting to see all of the related innovation, to see what Rio Tinto is doing with their remote operations from their facility in Perth far out into the countryside. And also to understand that Australia and Australian companies are not just active at home, but they are also global partners here in the United States and around the world. And I think that's one of the distinguishing aspects, especially of our critical minerals relationship. Australia, of course, was a founding member of the Minerals Security Partnership. And it was interesting for me to hear the back and forth between DQ and DFAT, because just like State Department, Department of Energy, we have different authorities. And with DQ looking at investments that can be made on domestic mineral supply chains, but DFAT looking at how they can leverage their foreign assistance authorities in other countries in Southeast Asia, where of course Australia plays a leading role, but also in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. Exactly the same way my team at the State Department is trying to think about how we leverage our resources and our partnerships at the Export-Import Bank, the Development Finance Corporation, the Trade Development Agency, to mobilize the official resources that can catalyze private investment to drive the growth that we need in this sector.
You made a lot of good points there, so I'm going to start with the human capital, the education environment. Australia, if you look at the top 12 mine engineering programs in the world, Australia has 4 of them. A lot of our mining talent, technical management has started in Australia and been exported to the world. I look at one of our own American mining companies, Newmont, is run by an Australian, Tom Palmer. So how can we better collaborate to build human capital, which is not only a US shortage, but it's a global shortage in the mining industry? How can we strengthen that collaboration on the education front?
So first of all, we have to be smarter. And, again, the experience of going to Perth was so helpful because it really puts a human face on a lot of this. And I think on my flight and I came in through Melbourne, and I think on my flight from Perth, I was probably one of the only people on that plane who wasn't carrying a hard hat on my backpack with mining company uniforms, because you see how the industry itself is evolving, the use of technology to work smarter for remote operations. I talked about that earlier. The issues around electrification that I alluded to as well. We have exactly the same challenges here in the United States. In some ways, seeing how Australian mining companies operate, what it reminded me most of was Alaska, because we have the same challenges in Alaska, where there's a huge incentive to innovate because the cost of delivering a liter of diesel to a mining site or an extraction site on the North Slope is so high that provides a huge incentive for looking really hard at both how you can work more efficiently, how you can work with fewer people on the work site, and how you can do as much as possible through renewable sources. So there's a lot of synergy that's going to happen there. And I think this also goes to the fundamental challenge that we face in the context of needing to massively scale the volumes of these energy minerals which we have available to us. We have to reduce the marginal cost. And that's going to happen, as you said, a lot of that work, the foundational work, is going to happen at universities and research institutes, whether in Australia or at the Colorado School of Mines here in the US. But it's also going to happen because of companies that face the discipline of their shareholders and the discipline of quarterly financial results, which encourage them to figure out how to deliver the greatest possible value.
Absolutely. That cross-pollination of knowledge is just so important. I was thinking, we were talking about rare earths earlier, which we know is like a central focus given the reliance on China for processing rare earths for 90%. It's an Australian company who actually received the Defense Production Act company to build our rare earth separation facilities in the US, which will be the first in the hemisphere and one of the biggest outside of China. How do we continue to ensure that capital is moving in a way that maximizes outcomes?
So that's one of the things that we're committed to work on together through the US-Australia Critical Minerals Task Force. We also need to figure out how we leverage other allies. So Australia, for instance, has been particularly successful in some of these processing sectors, also working with partners like Japan, leveraging the resources that Japan is able to mobilize through JOGMEC. And I think the ability to mobilize, especially in these industries like mining, which is unique in terms of the enormous upfront capex that's required to grow a facility, and the burden that that creates and the requirement that that creates for patient capital. And then figuring out how to avoid the temptation, the corporate temptation to say, well, we're just going to buy the cheap product from China because it's so darn expensive to create an alternative supply chain. There, in fact, is a hidden cost of energy insecurity, and we need to internalize that. Just as I think Europe has learned that the price tag of cheap Russian gas is not just what Gazprom charges, it's also the energy insecurity that comes with that dependence. And that's something that our two governments are talking about intensively. We're doing so in the face of challenges created by two moving targets. One is the head start that China enjoys, which gives China the ability to manipulate markets, as it is doing today, for instance, with oversupply of lithium, but also the reality that future demand is going to far outstrip what we have today. So to take the example of lithium, you have a sector where there's current overproduction, which has created enormous political challenges, including in Australia, where, as you alluded to, you have several facilities that have gone into care and maintenance. You have the example of, well, nickel, but also on lithium, but the same dynamic where you have facilities which are being held back by the current overproduction, where you look a few years out, the demand is going to be there. That's why I paid a lot of attention to Rio Tinto's announcement this week on Arcadium, where they are making a long-term bet that the demand is going to catch up with the current oversupply in a way that will pay off, and that is going to be an industry and a sector that is fundamental to long-term energy transition.
It's interesting. It's lithium, it's nickel, it's cobalt. I mean, I'm thinking about how America's only primary cobalt mine opened and closed last year,
right,
partially because Chinese companies in the Congo are producing so much cobalt.
Yeah.
So it's like a systemic challenge we have across the board. And again, what's hard is that the cost of doing business, if you're doing it right, is higher. So it puts companies that aren't doing it right at a disadvantage. Now, one of I think my final questions here is, I mean, you've been such an important role with the MSP, the Mineral Security Partnership. And Australia has been such a key part of the MSP. When I spend time in countries like Tanzania or Namibia, I mean, Australia is playing really actively in these spaces, and the US is playing quite actively and showing up and engaging in these markets as well. What has been the added benefit, and how can we strengthen our partnership working together with our Australian friends in emerging markets? Because it's going to be impossible to meet future need if I take China out of the calculus and to try to do it without our emerging markets.
Yeah. So first point I would make, I mean, one of Australia's great strengths as part of the MSP conversation is you don't have to tell anybody in Australia or in the Australian government why energy minerals are so important to the future. That's an assumed fact coming into the conversation. I think as we look to the future, the challenge is exactly what you described. We have to grow our domestic supplies. That's true in Australia. It's true in the United States. But we also have to significantly expand the opportunities for both extraction and processing globally. And we need to do so in a way that delivers value for the producer countries. I think this is another area where Australia has a very strong calling card, which is the ESG principles that its companies are committed to. Nobody worries that an Australian mining company is going to cut corners on environmental or worker rights issues because it faces the scrutiny of its shareholders and its regulators at home. So we've got to figure out how do we market that aspect to demonstrate, as my boss, Secretary Blinken, likes to say, that we are delivering a better offer, especially to the producer countries in the developing world. In this regard, I think we're at a moment of tremendous opportunity, because across the board, what I hear is a desire to find an alternative to the traditional model in this sector, and to do so in a way that is perceived in the developing world as equitable, as ensuring that the producer countries see the benefits of their resources, as they should expect, and that there are investments made in human capital formation, in infrastructure, in order to guarantee that governments are able to demonstrate to their citizens that there is a reward for pulling out the commodities of their earth, but in a way that is sustainable and delivers net benefit for the societies. So I think there's a very strong alignment between the U.S. and Australia on these issues. There's obviously a very, very strong political commitment in both Washington and in Canberra to being seen to be working together, and that's the advantage of working with a longtime ally like Australia, is everybody's very comfortable with each other. You could argue, both you and I are here in Washington, where you could argue Australia may have the best brand of any country in the world in the United States right now. I've never met anybody who doesn't have good feelings about Australia and our Australian allies. So we got to figure out how we leverage that into these critical sets of issues where there's a very strong political alignment in terms of the destination that we want to reach.
You made some great points, and I think there's three key takeaways I take from this conversation. One is that partnership is really important to increase investment in the U.S., to increase investments in Australia and in emerging markets, but in a way that we can create a resilient mine to manufactured supply chain. Sometimes we have a tendency to talk about just the minerals or just the processing or just the manufacturing. But one of Australia's key advantages for us as the United States here in Washington is they've had a decades-long advantage in building processing capacity, inputs like machinery, helping us get to our manufactured goods that we need for national economic and energy security. Assistant Secretary Pyatt, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you all for letting us be a part of your event from many, many thousand miles away.